cattle ranchers would show me their latest scheme to take advantage of government subsidies. My sawmill friends would show me what they did with their tax-free investments in their timber industries. And it was a real learning experience. And I grew to appreciate what a landscape looks like when the institutions are not really functioning in defense of the public good. And after 23 years, I think, of running big experiments in the Amazon and torturing trees and burning trees, and Yadvinder has done his own share of that. I was really intrigued by the idea of getting more on the policy, more on the solution side of things, and went to the Moore Foundation to run the conservation program there, just as Arnold Schwarzenegger was putting in place the Global Warming Solution Acts of California, which had in it something called the International Offset Provision, which meant that companies in California that came under the cap could offset some of those emissions to stay under the cap by buying offsets from partner states and provinces around the world. And he brought governors from Brazil, from Indonesia. And it's one of the things I was able to fund that became the Governor's Climate Forest Task Force. And I realized that all of these tropical forest states and provinces and regional governments really don't know how to, everything they have to do to tap into this new market, which, by the way, still doesn't exist. California's market has not been implemented yet. But that's when I realized maybe we need a new type of organization, and that's how we created the Earth Innovation Institute in San Francisco. So that's a little bit of introduction of who we are. Today, I want to share with you some ideas. A lot of them are haven't really been tested, so consider yourselves guinea pigs. Push back, yell at me, whatever. Let's see.
You have to click the screen. Just activate it.
My first point is I think nature-based solutions to climate change are undervalued generally. I think we don't give them enough credit. We've let ourselves be sort of marginalized. The real thing we really need to do to save the planet is to get off of fossil fuel. And I always like to start by reminding everyone, and I know you guys don't need reminding, that the terrestrial carbon sink is really big. The oceanic carbon sink is really big. And it's those two together about 55% of emissions from all human activities. It gets sucked out of the atmosphere. And I'd like to look at the Amazon in that frame. That is, it is a piece of this sink, but that piece is getting weaker. And can it be managed? And I think nature-based solutions essentially are about managing terrestrial carbon pools for positive outcomes, not just for climate, but for biodiversity, for people, for water cycles, et cetera. And the conversation I was going to refer to was at the Museo Gelji Yadvinder, when this guy was just setting up the Rainford collaboration with other collaborators, and which has been a phenomenally important study. We're talking about where to find permanent plots in the Eastern Amazon, which are hard to find. But the Amazon sink is getting weaker. And I know we don't have real recent data on this. Last year with the mega drought, I'm sure that there was probably a lot of tree mortality that makes it a non-sink here. But the point is this inevitable? Could the Amazon forest become a carbon sink again? And what would that look like? What would have to happen? And how would we fund it? Could climate finance, in all of its dysfunctionality and fragmentation that we have today in 2025, which is unbelievable, could it fund it? Could we summon funding at the scale to really turn the arc on Amazon carbon off? This for me is a really key piece of this, because the governments of something like 70% of the Amazon biome are engaged in developing something called jurisdictional red programs. And some of them have been doing it for more than 10 years. This all goes back to the Conference of the Parties in Bali in 2007, when REDD, REDD, reductions in emissions from deforestation and degradation, came into the UNFCCC negotiation stream. And since then, there were key moments: Cancun in 2010, Warsaw in 2013 or 14. Key pieces of the global framework for REDD have been agreed upon, right? But the market mechanism has not. We don't have it yet. We've got a little bit of it with the voluntary carbon market, and that's why these political leaders are mobilizing. And sort of true to that original idea, this is what we do in the Amazon. We're supporting 6 states in the Amazon, a couple in Peru, and in Colombia, they don't let their subnationals do jurisdictional REDD, so we do other things there. But each one of these is an experiment too. And I want to mention that if anyone's looking for a research project involving regional governance, multi-stakeholder processes, carbon accounting, land use interventions, every one of these is a fascinating experiment. So you might ask, but isn't REDD just a bunch of hot air? You know, Thales West and others have documented that a lot of REDD projects are overclaiming. And I don't find many people who've ever heard of jurisdictional REDD or realize that there are project level interventions and that there are regional interventions, and they're extremely different. If we were to summarize some of the key features of projects from REDD versus jurisdictional approaches, first is really who's leading them. Projects are generally led by project developers, they're for-profit companies, whereas jurisdictional REDD programs are led by governments with multi-stakeholder governance structures. So everyone has to have a seat on the table if you're a significant rural or land sector. 2 of them involve the sale of credits and a market mechanism. This piece right here does not. Jurisdictional REDD through results-based payment is basically a donation. And in return from that donation, you get a certificate that says you donated. And those emissions reductions on the UNFCCC registry get retired. And there's a document there saying these were retired because of this donation. This is very new. The first emission of credits was in the last 2 years. These have been along for a long time. Tiny, big, right? These are giant Amazon states, so what we're going to talk about today. And these are more like communities or a farm or a concession. Big role for policy and governments, little or no role. And multi-stakeholder, I already mentioned. And because the areas are so much bigger, the risk of leakage of that activity, just you've suppressed it here, it goes over here, is much smaller. You know, if you have a 1 million square kilometer territory, you have to go a long way to leave the boundaries of that territory. Risk of reversal is also much lower. And I think a really important point here is that to succeed at jurisdictional REDD, you have to have functional laws and institutions. They have to increase their transparency. Every meeting has to be posted. You have to have safeguards to protect against human rights abuses, consultation abuses. There have to be environmental safeguards. And it really, I think, aligns with what the recent Nobel laureate, Darren Osemoglu, talks about when he talks about inclusive institutions as being the basis of economic prosperity in the long term, as opposed to extractive institutions, which are really designed to help powerful actors appropriate natural resources and other things. To begin with, there's a huge amount of distrust in carbon markets in the Amazon. Brazil did a phenomenal job. It wasn't just the federal government or just the state governments or just the market interventions that were brought about. It was helped by a downward cycle of soy and many other things, but brought deforestation down from its 10-year average by almost 80%. And it didn't really get back up to that earlier level, so that over the course of 15 years, it kept about 8 billion tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere and in trees, which is remains today one of the biggest, if not the biggest, contributions to climate change mitigation. And what really strikes me is the international community didn't come through, right? The global framework we were all hoping for in Copenhagen did not happen. There wasn't a global framework for carbon transactions until Paris. And now 10 years after Paris, we're finally getting to international transaction framework through Article 6 in 2025. So these little yellow pieces, those represent those emissions reductions that were retired because of donations to the Amazon, but also to Acre through the Red for Early Mover program, to Mato Grosso, to the Ministry of Environment, et cetera. And that is the basis even today of governors who tell me, yeah, red is sort of like the Holy Spirit. You know, it's out there, but no one ever sees it. Or some people compare it to the head of bacalhau. Bacalhau is a codfish, which you never see the head by the time it makes it to the market. But I want to talk about this bait and switch problem. I think we've constructed a system that has a lot of perverse incentives to really prevent funding, finance to go to scale for nature. I think one of the fundamental conditions we need to achieve is where companies and governments that are decarbonizing fastest are more competitive, right? Their economies are growing better. As companies, they're outcompeting their competitors. And we don't have that condition today. Let's start with the Paris Agreement. Article 6 is designed to facilitate international transactions. And the basic idea is, let's push all the countries to take on commitments to reduce, decarbonize their economies. And whatever's above and beyond that, they can trade. If you're low and you need to buy, you can buy from another country. But it's perverse in that the more ambitious you are, the fewer credits you'll have to sell. You have less funding if you're more ambitious. And a solution to that would be to allow voluntary carbon markets transactions to take place without corresponding adjustments. In other words, independent of your NDC. And the VCM initiative landed on that as guidance, but many countries today don't believe it. Colombia doesn't believe it. Indonesia doesn't believe it. They think that you have to have this tie-in to your NDC, your nationally determined contribution, in order to transact those credits under Article 6. We could have a two-tiered NDC system where, okay, this is what we think we can decarbonize alone, and above this is what we can do if we're getting funding. And Indonesia did that around the Paris Agreement, and it was sort of ignored, but I think maybe it's something we need to get back to. The other perverse incentive are historical baselines, by definition, ignore the increase in emissions that are taking place because of climate change. In other words, you're depleting the potential revenues going to tropical forest regions because, take 2024 as an example. Huge drought, huge fire. And we were sat down with Mato Grosso government to do the numbers, and their deforestation rates are way down. Emissions from deforestation are way down, and they lost all of their potential credits because of fires. They were fighting fires. but they're just overwhelmed. Para is losing. We still don't know the final count there, but basically you're saying, no, we're only going to look backwards, and that is our baseline. We're not going to include things like catastrophic fires, even though that will greatly reduce the funding you have to deal with those fires. So we need a new baseline methodology. It needs to be super simple, something like 50%, something really simple. I don't think it can be modeled. I think we have to find a solution there. I'm going to say something I probably shouldn't, but science-based targets, what a great name. Who can argue with science-based targets, right? What science-based targets have become, that's a whole thing of providing guidance to companies on what is a good and responsible decarbonization strategy. That's great. But what it in fact has become is a way of certifying companies, their decarbonization strategies, and how much they are allowed to purchase as offsets. And that has squeezed the offset market demand. And it's based on the assumption that it's really, if you're buying a lot of offsets, you're not going to be investing in your own decarbonization. But Ecosystem Marketplace, they tapped into the CDP database with a few thousand, 7,000 maybe companies that disclose under the CDP. And they found that companies that buy offsets invest 3 times more in their own decarbonization. And because they want to not depend upon buying offsets, it's a cost. And if the price of offsets goes up because a lot of companies are buying them, we're going to have a huge revenue stream for nature, and companies are going to be investing more in their decarbonization. I'm sure that wouldn't work out quite so neatly, but as a result, we have the LEAF Coalition, a tremendously important group of 26, I think, companies, plus UK, plus Norway and the US. Everything of US is now past tense, right? But sad to say. They really plateaued out at a $1.5 billion aggregate demand signal. That's sort of backed off recently. And it's because they have required that all the companies be SBTI. And that has constrained the demand there so much that one Amazon state could absorb this funding. So we need to, I think, clearly define what are high integrity credits and make sure companies are buying those high integrity credits, direct the power of environmental advocacy to go after companies that are buying lousy credits, offsets, but also deepen our understanding of what are the levers that can be pulled to accelerate decarbonization. Voluntary action is probably not going to get us there, especially if that voluntary action is not making your company more competitive. And we're seeing right now this really big backslide on ESG, corporate commitments around the funding initiative, Blackstone backing out. I mean, these are not very solid, commitments to climate change if there's not a policy framework and regulatory framework that's pushing these companies in that direction. Another perverse incentive, and this played out this last December. And believe me, I know you do not make profits with jurisdictional red. It's really hard as a company to make profits with jurisdictional red. The government is the protagonist. With a private project, you have a project developer who gets anywhere from 30 to 70% of the revenues. And sometimes that's a really, really profitable venture. And because of that, there's a lot of lobbying done on behalf of projects. And we learned from legislators in Brazil in December that just the degree to which this was focused on Brazil's SCBE, the Brazilian Emissions Trading System, which is voted into law in December and now has to be regulated. Basically, if that regulation goes one way, jurisdictional red will be dead in the state. and projects will thrive. If it goes the other way, we'll be able to maintain jurisdictional red. And so basically jurisdictional red, the proponents are state governments, they're the sectors who believe they will benefit by it. And it's not enough. So we need a lot better communication around the differences between these mechanisms. And finally, my last perverse mechanism is zero deforestation movement. And now this is really embedded in the whole paradigm of corporate risk management, how to make it riskier if you're doing the wrong thing. And the metric, because of that paradigm, is farm level deforestation cutoff dates. And this probably the best early example was the soy moratorium in Brazil. July 2006, if you cleared after that date and you're a soy farmer, all of these companies would not buy from you. And then it was shifted to 2008. It's embedded in the EU deforestation regulation. And what it means is that companies are migrating away from frontiers. It's a lot more expensive to source soy, beef, palm oil in an active frontier zone where there's a lot of clearing taking place. If there's a low risk zone, it's much easier to source and claim your zero deforestation status. We need companies to do just the opposite. We need responsible companies to mobilize their capital, site their processing facilities, their mills, their power plants in the war zone, in the tropical deforestation frontiers. And that's not happening. I think the solution here is to blend the power of corporate action that we get with supply chain initiatives with the jurisdictional approach. Try to capture this here, just the critical importance of metrics. If your metric is farm level deforestation cutoff dates, that means you're not really worried if deforestation regionally is going down or not. Brazil Amazon deforestation started cranking up in 2014, which is the same year the New York Declaration on Forests consolidated zero deforestation as sort of the new paradigm for the next decade. And it was supposed to be just the opposite. And I think it's because of this disconnect in core metrics. So let's get back to the Amazon. I think everyone knows today that it's not just deforestation, there's risk of fire dieback, as we saw in 2024 playing out, severe drought, making forests very vulnerable to fire, and that fire in turn making the forests even more vulnerable to fire. And this question of managing the dieback, I think there's the deforestation part that gets most of the attention, but then there's the fire part that needs more attention. And but the basic idea that in a region where rainfall is at least partially dependent upon forests, putting more forests back on the landscape is the best thing we can do to reduce the likelihood of an extensive dieback and a tipping point. So on deforestation, I only show one slide here. We've learned that command and control can work, but it has a limited period of effectiveness because governments get tired of paying the bills, especially if there's no recognition, no funding coming in because of your success. And politically, it's hard to maintain the political will, if you're pushing back against your farm sectors without an upside. And I think what we have the opportunity now to really think about is using jurisdictional red revenues to really ramp up cattle intensification, diversification of cattle ranches into other activities, but also to think about, and this is not necessarily a money issue, but a cultural shift. Today, if you raise as I've done with a group of cattle ranchers, their thoughts on how much their rainfall depends upon forests. And people laugh. They say, oh, that's Greenpeace, that's NGOs, that's just, people messing with our heads. And then Louise Molion comes in, who was, a serious climatologist. And he just says it's all bunk, there's no climate change, and those voices carry tremendous weight with these really powerful farm sectors. And that makes it to the political leaders. And because of that, even though a forest positive development pathway means clear air, I mean, living in Paragominas, what impressed me most in the dry season was just how lousy the air was. You're constantly hacking and you've got a congested head. And we did a study of the impact of that, and thousands of kids die every year during the dry season because of bad air. I mean, that's not part of the debate today. Rainfall security is not part of the debate. Agricultural system collapse during drought and mitigating that through more forests is not really part of the debate. I think aquaculture could really take off and occupy a critical role in growing more with a shrinking area of productive open land. Kilo for kilo, aquaculture. This is not aquaculture, by the way. This is a managed lake in the floodplain of the Amazon near Santarém. But you only require about 1/20th as much land. And that's just with, not a super high-tech aquaculture system. And this study by Instituto Escolhas really lays out a lot of the policy barriers. A lot of it is really just licensing, how you overcome the various legislative hurdles there are to putting in a pond or what have you. And a lot of them are basically regulatory. There's several different systems. One of the huge potential new expansions for fish protein in the Amazon are the reservoirs. We're working with the Pará government now on really taking a close look at the Tucuruí and Belo Monte reservoirs for net cage aquaculture. And it's a much bigger market than beef, and it's growing more quickly. One of the big challenges is to favor native species when tilapia is so easy to grow. But let's get back to fire. And how do we slow fire? And here, Aliança da Terra, which we set up in 2004 as an NGO to support farmers who want to make the transition to sustainable production. And it was a controversial NGO at the time. And the niche they really found was firefighting. So they've created an approach to firefighting. And well documented, it really does put out a lot of fires. But the core idea is train people well across the landscape so that when a fire occurs, you don't have to call city fire brigade to, hope they're working that day, get in their vehicle, hope there's gas. And by then the fire is already burned through your property. Have an early detection network, a phone number, a WhatsApp group where you can report fires, do pre-burn season planning. And right now we're working with Alianças to design municipal planning processes and training so that when the red funds come, we hope they're going to come. We'll have examples in Tocantins and Mato Grosso of how that can be used for these fire approaches. This extends to indigenous people as well. I don't know if the Upper Xingu, the Park Indigenous of Xingu, is in the epicenter really of where climate change is affecting the edge of the forest. And Aliança helped them design and train their own fire brigade. And that's what they do. And they have a lot of work to do every year. Fires in mature forests are surprisingly easy to put out. You can step over them. They burn slowly, and they're variable depending on the conditions of the burning day, of course. But yet they still burn for weeks, and they go through huge areas of forest if there's no one organized to put them out. And a 50-centimeter fire break can stop these fires. You need a chainsaw to cut through the logs as well. But what happens when they're burned, this is a transition forest that we've ran an experiment on for many years in Mato Grosso. But the fact that they're slow moving fires means that they have a long residence time at the base of the trees. A lot of trees die. That lets more light come in. So you get grasses and ferns and other things growing in the understory. And that is fuel, that plus the biomass from the dying trees. And so the second fire is a lot worse. And this is after 2 or 3 fires. One of our plots we burnt at 3-year intervals. There was a lot of pasture nearby, and I think that was a big source of grass seed that you don't always have, but this is the same forest. The only difference is fire and no fire, and no chainsaws. Fire alone can give you a dieback that looks something like this. I think it's really important here to think about, the economic logic of fire. And there's actually a virtuous fire cycle that we can set in motion. If I'm a rancher and I've just fertilized and improved my cattle pasture, and fire gets into it, I have to take that pasture out of production for 4 to 6 months before the grass reestablishes itself. I have to rent pasture from neighbors to support my cattle. I mean, it's a real cost. You lose fencing, you lose houses and buildings. If I have tree crops, I'm going to lose those. And that means you're also less willing to make those investments as long as they can be lost to fire. But as you accumulate those investments on the landscape, people use fire less and they invest more in fire prevention. And I think that's a key part of the virtuous cycle that we're after. So let's take this down and try to think of how big of a role the Amazon could play in reducing emissions at a global scale. And this is a quick description of the 2 scenarios we ran. We're in the process of trying to get this published. But basically, pretty reasonable scenarios. 80% reduction in deforestation and fire area burned by 2030. Right now, we're at 50% reduction in Brazil and close to that in Colombia. 95% by 2050. We do not assume zero deforestation, which I think is important. Incentives for secondary forest regeneration. That's a big deal. Today, farmers want to burn their secondary forests, which cover 20% of the Amazon, the Pan Amazon. Why? Because they have to get out a new license to deforest if you get more than 50 trees of 10 centimeter diameter per hectare. So they don't want to get their forest to get that high. But if there were a positive incentive, I think a lot of farmers would protect their forests. We included a shift to low impact timber harvest faster than what we're seeing today. And then the BAU, we just held deforestation flat and you all around those projections of future forest fire. And in a nutshell, these are the different types of forests going into the future. And at the beginning of this Pan Amazon, we had 17% of the Pan Amazon cleared. And after this, there's this category here too, where we just assume that a pretty gradual rate of increase of tree crops. And these are things like acai and cacao and coffee and timber species. But basically we could, even with those pretty conservative assumptions, the forest could become net positive beginning in the next few years. And if we add up all of the emissions, and it was remarkably difficult to do this, the data sets are from different sources and they're sort of all over the place. But these are net emissions from all, including uptake by primary forests, that sink that we talked about in the very beginning. And basically, the Amazon was about a gigaton CO2 per year of net uptake, and that's been weakening. And there was the soy boom of the early Mato Grosso, clearing responsible for about half of that deforestation. And, and what strikes me is where we could get to. And the shape of this curve, of course, is up for grabs. But basically, we could reestablish a carbon sink because of all of these degraded and secondary forests that could regrow, right? There's huge potential for these forests to regrow. They won't regrow forever, but they'll accumulate carbon for some number of decades until they plateau off. Now, to pay for that, we need to translate those emissions reductions into credits. So using the trees standard, which is the only operational standard for jurisdictional RED, we would have about 100 million tons available by 2026. We might have some issued by COP30, possibly. So at $10 a credit, that's $1 billion. The Amazon Fund, in its first nearly 20 years, has basically dispersed a little more than that, maybe 1.5 million, in a very onerous way. It takes years to get those grants, and they're very difficult to spend as well by state governments. After that, there could be 200 to 300 million tons per year of credits. And that would be an annual stream of, $2 or $3 billion, depending upon the price. So this could actually be the serious funding we've been waiting for, so that these governors do not feel like they've been led to a bait and switch again. And that's just the Amazon. That doesn't include the Cerrado. Mato Piba, every state is in. Maranhão, Tocantins, Piauí. Bahia is considering coming into jurisdictional RED. So it could be that we have most of the soy frontier of Brazil in a jurisdictional RED program. But this is demand. This is actual transactions of credits in the voluntary carbon market restricted to forest and land use credits. And we had a big peak. I think this is because of all the momentum leading into Glasgow, the net zero movement. I think it's because of Justin, actually. Justin was such an articulate spokesperson. Seriously, Justin had played a huge role in just building momentum going into Glasgow. And now it's fallen off. Justin has also played a huge role in natural climate solutions and formulating that, of course. 2024 is about similar. So we're at 40 million tons of demand, with the Amazon states, Brazil, just the Amazon states coming in with 100, then 200 million per year of offer of supply. So we're going to see a huge price crash and deception and frustration. So one idea we're working with, and I'm almost wrapping up here, is the idea of a fossil fuel levy, fossil fuel fee that is paid, and it's tied to your scope 3 emissions. Your scope 3 emissions in the case of fossil fuel are the emissions from the burning of oil, gas, and coal. If 1% of the scope 3 emissions were translated into the purchase of an equivalent volume JRED credits, that would be 360 million tons a year. So that would be 10 times current demand if it were sector-wide. Right now, President Lula, we hope, will soon be asked to instruct Petrobras to lead this and to get a few companies together on this commitment to be announced at COP30. There's a very good chance that it will not happen, okay? But it's one approach. And it does beg the question of, why is fossil fuel not paying more if that's the real reason for the dilemma we're in? And there's this very serious and important concern about not giving fossil fuel companies license to operate, not letting them, buy their way out of their problem by, cleaning up their gasoline, offering carbon neutral gasoline at the pumps. But maybe we can adopt a polluter pay principle so that it's clear to everyone, this is 1%. This is a tiny fraction of damages caused by these emissions. And anyway, this is a broader discussion. we need a tax on fossil fuel that's as close to the source as possible. And maybe something like this is a way of beginning to pay that tax. In the field of demand, we talked about the Leaf Coalition, Mercurio, which is the company no one's ever heard of that's ready to buy credits left and right, but without a price guarantees yet. They've set up a fund called Sylvania, and it's set up mostly actually by the CEO of Mercurio, Mark Lamont. That's a $500 million fund, and they've committed $100 million to partner with other companies and get Brazilian states moving in their jurisdictional RED programs. So this funding would go towards those startup costs. It would be an upfront commitment, which is a serious gap that states face. They don't have the money initially to invest in their programs. So this is a very positive outcome, I think. It's, in addition to LEAF, we need both to work. And another possibility is an agreement between China and Brazil to establish a nature and climate collaboration. These two countries, we better report on this, I forgot to put on here, but are incredibly mutually dependent. Without Brazil, China has a serious food crisis on its hands. Soy is the main source of feed for its pork and poultry industries. And China is now the world's biggest importer of beef, mostly from Brazil, not all. Uruguay and others are also exporters. And they have mutual aspirations to be climate leaders. The BRICS is now a much more expanded coalition of developing nations. There's keen interest in seeing United States and Europe marginalized in these processes. And the United States and EU in many ways are collaborating with that. UK is standing firm though. The 32 bilateral agreements were signed between Xi Jinping and Lula on the margins of the G20 meeting in November. It's really sort of a perfect storm for them to collaborate. But what would that look like? What we're discussing with Governor Hildur Babayu, who is the host of COP30, and some other folks, members of several other states, but also national entities, is the possibility of jurisdictional RED being featured in this collaboration, where China recognizes jurisdictional RED as sort of a regional certification. It's not farm by farm. China is very cost diverse in its commodities, and it's not going to pay anything for sustainability. That's clear. COFCO is the exception in some cases because of the markets they work in. But it would basically say that statewide declines in deforestation, forest degradation, and social inclusion, safeguards, all of the things that are wrapped up into jurisdictional RED, are considered progress. We could add into those farm level metrics like percentage of rural properties that have validated cars, that have land titles, and all of that. The punishment would not be market sanctions. You're cut out of our market. They would be the funding dries up, right? There would be a shared commitment and interest in seeing those emissions reductions coming down. Part of the agenda would be, and this could not happen by COP30, I think there could probably be an announcement by COP30, but could be a Brazilian-China ITMO, an internationally transferred mitigation outcome under Article 6.2, which now has rules defined, but that features jurisdictional RED credits. And here it would bump up against the ambition of Brazil's NDC. Will Brazil have credits left over, emissions reductions left over? But there are all sorts of, China is keenly interested in low carbon commodities. They don't want to be blamed for causing deforestation, right? And you could inset jurisdictional RED credits in beef and soy and offer those products to China. They could add capital to Brazil's low carbon agriculture program, which is now loaning out about $1.5 billion a year. And it's fully subscribed, well, almost fully, and needs more capital. anyway, there's lots of options here. So in closing, I want to come back to what I said about Paragominas in 1984. When you go back to Paragominas now, it is a thriving town, and institutions do not work perfectly, but they do work. There's law enforcement, there's social services. The frontier, you don't see the evidence of the frontier anymore. And I think the idea that inclusive, transparent, accountable institutions are the basis for these transitions is fundamental. There's no workaround, you know. From my perspective, jurisdictional red, and I'm not biased at all, is the best opportunity for moving down this pathway because it features this institutional element. The states that are doing jurisdictional red, 6 of the 9 Amazon states have created agencies for Indigenous peoples' issues that are led by Indigenous leaders. That's a direct outcome of the pathway to jurisdictional red. That is a win. All of the meetings of these agencies, not just Indigenous, but all agencies, now posted on the website. There's accountability and serious investment in multi-stakeholder governance. All of this needs to happen, of course, as institutional, inclusive institutions are being dismantled in the United States. I live in Germany, you know, we're facing elections where far-right populists could soon play a much bigger role. And it's a frightening time in that sense. And I think this is my last slide. We have to acknowledge that China is a leader in climate change. And it's certainly that in batteries and EV, electric vehicles, and solar, but it's also poised to be a leader in forests. But it's going to be a very different approach from EU, from the UK, from the US. But I think China could be a critical leader on this issue in the years ahead for nature. Fossil fuel producers need to pay. We need to make fossil fuel more expensive. And we need to use some sort of subsidy from fossil fuel to fund nature. And that's the only, there's no big source of public funding we can tap into that is anywhere close to the size of fossil fuel as a potential funder of nature. But we need to do it in a way, of course, it's not going to legitimate fossil fuel, but also acknowledge that it's not buying some offsets that's going to give our fossil fuel companies a license to operate. The fact is that all of us who rely on fossil fuel and the policies that perpetuate fossil fuel are what is the basis for that license to operate. And the best antidote, I think, for far-right populism is partnership, bridge building, multi-sectorialism. Is that a word? I don't think so. And expanding that coalition for the common good. It means avoiding temptations to throw rocks at people who are not aligned with us. It means finding ways to collaborate on sources of overlapping interests that can bring us together. Thank you. Sorry for.
Perfect timing. Great. So we can open up to questions. And Dan, if you could repeat the questions to the microphone for the online audience. As well. So does anyone want to kick off? Eric?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Nepstad, for the amazing presentation. I guess one way or another for jurisdictional red to work, it will depend a lot on the actions or inactions of a lot of stakeholders, not just the national government, but there's also producers, cattle ranchers, indigenous communities, amongst others. So I was just wondering who really gets to benefit? How is the benefits that accrue from the mitigation distributed? Who gets to benefit from it?
So who gets the benefits from jurisdictional red revenues, right, from the sale of credits? That's a great question. And I think part of the jurisdictional red process is something called a benefit sharing strategy. We're at the end of a few of those right now with Brazilian states. And first thing I think is that they provide a forum for complaints, for opinions, for having dialogues between sectors that I don't really see happening elsewhere. The basis for most of these divisions is a combination of who owns the stocks and controls and who is responsible for the fluxes. And that often favors farm sectors, but there's usually adjustments that are made where what we're trying to introduce is, let's make sure this thing works, that emissions come down, because it's emissions coming down, that's the basis for the entire revenue pool. Right now, indigenous people and traditional communities are very opposed to cattle sector and soy sector have any role in the benefit sharing. They want them out, not all of them, but, and it's led to some fascinating, very heated debates. And I think what we're going to come out with, though, is, you know, you can either have all of the credits and revenues going to you, and the program produces this many emissions reductions, or you can get the sectors that are really the source of the emissions on board, and your revenues will be like this, but they're also getting benefits. The way the benefits arrive to, they're not, most of them are not payments. There's very few payments. It's not a good way to use the money. What the cattle sector programs we're working with, they want improvements in the calving operations. And those are smallholders, it's family agriculture. And they're not expecting payments. They want improvements in infrastructure, rural extension, and things like that. And so I think it's a very fascinating process to see how the sectors are learning about each other's perspectives. But it has to go, it's only approved once all sectors basically sign off on it. And I think, you know, we see complaints about consultation process. For me, that's completely healthy. That's the fact that there's, you know, a forum for having those complaints is exactly what we need.
Okay, I'll mention, so ask a question. So you talked about this possible Brazil-China deal, jurisdictional rates, and given the demand and increasing demand for beef and soy from China, is there a risk of a higher level of leakage, demand-driven leakage there, or are there ways? Well, I know for beef there are ways of producing more land efficiently. For soy, is there a similar solution? How do we avoid that actually just causing demand still there, but that deforestation occurring somewhere else?
There definitely is that risk. If that were to happen, then I think the emissions reductions would not be there, and the system would shut down. There would be no financial benefit anymore. And I think that is a very interesting sort of incentive to have there, where you're going to lose money as opposed to being cut off from a market. You know, the EUDR reduction among a lot of farmers, Mato Grosso, I think about 30% of the producers, we looked at the car applications, are already disqualified from the market. And so they're moving on, right? But we need something that year by year, everyone's sort of thinking about, how can we keep that money coming in because it's bringing benefits? So it would be an incentive to squeeze more production onto existing cleared lands as you let marginal lands go back into forest and keep fire out of other things. And a lot of the emissions reductions can come from reduced fire too.
Thanks. Lee?
Thank you so much for your work here. Last year, there was a front page New York Times article about chemical deforestation happening in the Pantanal region of the Amazon, where somebody was like a big landowner there was flying a helicopter over like millions of acres of forest and spraying this chemical that was used in Agent Orange, and it was a defoliant that was causing the forest to just like slowly die out over time. And via satellites, it looked like just forest degradation, so it wasn't identified as deforestation. But then they were using it for beef, and that was presumably being exported to China. But I'm just curious, like, what kind of mechanisms are being used, especially for this kind of like large scale monitoring to ensure compliance, to like look for, like, are you kind of is currently the assumption that, you know, any kind of deforestation that's happening, we'll be able to measure it. And that is ground truth, or like what is the kind of verification process happening?
Yeah, the methodology that's accepted by the tree standard, it's pretty rigorous. I'd say we were talking earlier today about some of the holes in it, you know, degradation in savanna trees doesn't have a good methodology for it. But Manu and others are going to figure that out. And it's you know, the third version is under development right now. We're recommending that they bring in the technology that allows you to see degradation better, because it includes degradation, but you still have very bluntest instruments for measuring emissions from degradation. So I think the idea is nothing's going to be perfect in the beginning. Let's make sure it gets better over time, and call it out when it's making mistakes, and there will be mistakes.
So for context, in my previous job, I was on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Secretariat at the World Resource Institute, and now I'm a DPhil student at Oxford Net Zero. So obviously my question has to do with carbon accounting. While I fully agree in principle that, you know, big fossil fuel companies should be the ones paying for nature protection, where I think I'm very skeptical is whether there's a carbon credit that can be claimed with the additionality and permanence required to be counted against fossil fuels. Both given, you know, the debate around biogenic versus fossil carbon cycles, but also, yeah, the additionality question is kind of my main concern. You showed the two scenarios that you used, which was BAU, which included emissions from deforestation, and then the sort of solution. And I wonder what the net benefit would be if you calculated a no human activity counterfactual, which is sort of my opinion on how additionality should be determined.
So that, yeah, that fossil fuel suggestion I presented would assume that you don't use, the companies are not using them as offsets. They're using a polluter pay mechanism that basically just says, we've got this level of damage where our products are doing, and we're going to start compensating for those in some way. So, so you don't really need it to match up to fossil fuel damages, right? And, sure, the human freeze scenario, could you explain that before again?
Well, so if you're saying, oh, if RED wasn't in place, this would be cut down and converted to agriculture. To me, that's not an appropriate way to go about like calculating carbon credits. You can calculate the impact of converting land to agriculture, and you can, you know, count the impact of protecting it. But both of those scenarios should be compared to a scenario where humans are not involved. So what would have happened, you know, if the land were just left alone?
Yeah, I guess I don't see how that comes into what we're actually dealing with.
Well,
So,
because otherwise you're getting credit for doing what you're supposed to do anyways, which is not cut down the forest.
well, I think, you know, Brazil has a forest code. If you're to fully implement the laws of Brazil, you'd have 74% of the original forests protected. And that's Brazil's sovereign choice, that was the amount of forest that they wanted to set aside. And there's a potential to comply with that. The Brazilians want legal compliance to be the basis of any trade agreement, for example, because they don't see other countries with the level of protection that they demand from their farmers. And I think to use a sort of a human-free scenario as a counterfactual, it seems, I don't know, misleading. Like these are actual 30 million people in the Amazon, and they
No,
need
sorry, I mean like human, like you can't maybe we should discuss this later.
We're not at peak land use yet, right? We might be getting close, but for me, that's sort of, when we have opened up enough land to feed the human population until our population comes down, which it's already doing or will soon do. I don't know, that's sort of what the bottom line needs to be, right?
Maybe I can reframe by saying, in the absence of economic incentives, what would
We
happen?
can take this discussion afterwards. So.
Okay.
Yeah, Nat?
Thanks, Dan. That was amazing. I've got so many questions. But I just some recent work that's come out of our lab by Elisa Cerrone, who's a Brazilian mathematician, has done some modelling and shown that it's domestic consumption of beef in Brazil is the primary driver of deforestation in Brazil. So I'm just thinking about the China piece that you presented and thinking actually that there is more domestic production, and 6 companies are largely responsible for that. And actually the impact on deforestation of those 6 companies is significantly larger than the impact of the whole of the demand from the EU, for example, and a lot higher than that from China. So what is the implication for J-RED for that, basically regulation around those companies? You know, those companies could switch out elsewhere or switch their supply chains, but have you thought about that kind of interplay there?
Yeah, so you're exactly right, Natalie, that what is it, 85% of beef production stays in Brazil. And with JBS and Minerva and Marfrig and those other Brazilian companies controlling much of that, they're on the hook right now. They're dealing mostly with FEBRABAN, the Federation of Banks, that has a cutoff date for illegal deforestation for their primary and secondary suppliers. And there's a lot of work around that. And the meat packers are taking it pretty seriously because of the Ministerio Público, the public prosecutors are part of it and are ready to shut them down until they get to a new an agreement for how to proceed. What it means, I think, is that, you know, the leader of our program in Pará, he has 4 head per hectare on the intensive parts of his ranch, and he's moving in the other parts of his ranch out of cattle, and he wants to go into acai. But I think that's what's going to happen. You know, it's not going to be the 0.8 head per hectare, 50 kilos of meat per year per hectare, which is just a horrible way to use Amazon soils. It's going to go to 300, and the beef supply will grow that way. And the question is, how do we use jurisdictional red funds to make that happen more quickly? And it's a finance issue, it's a technical assistance. And right now, the bottleneck of the industry is the calving operations. They're the most vulnerable. And so I see it as a huge incentive to, well, there's that revenue on the horizon. Let's intensify sustainably. Let's shift to aquaculture, tree crops, and maybe the Amazon will shift back to fish, which is its culinary choice, you know, from we go back a few years.
My name's Anthony Melville. I work with a very small charity working in Ecuador on restoration of tropical forest areas. This is using inga trees. Ecuador is not part of your picture. Is that because it's just too small? Is there a possibility of jurisdictional red being taken up by Ecuadorian provinces, or what's your opinion on that?
Ecuador is very active in this, and I didn't refer to Ecuador just because so many of the examples are from Brazil, and but Ecuador has a national red program that is funded through the Red for Early Mover program. Pastaza is a member of the Governor's Climate Forest Task Force, and there's 2 other indigenous-led provinces that had joined 2 years ago. And the big question there is, does Ecuador open up to private market mechanisms, or do they stick with the public, that second type that I mentioned, where you have a contract with usually UK and Germany, the money comes in and there's some extra bureaucracy because it's public money. And that's what Ecuador is relying on right now. But they could easily open up to let their provinces do jurisdictional. I think that would be very, very interesting. And restoration could get a big influx of funding through that.
So where would I find out which of the other provinces other than Pastaza?
Governor's Climate Forest Task Force, Governor's GCF Task Force. On the website, they show all the members.
Okay. And could I ask an ancillary question? Is there any cases of money going? So one thing is restoration, but a lot of the people we're working with, small indigenous groups or individual farmers, have standing forests, which we need to stop them selling off because the Chinese want the balsa wood for wind turbine blades, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any money going to people to stop them selling their forest and keep it standing? Not offsets, obviously.
The great thing about jurisdictional red, and I don't want to sound like a salesman here, but jurisdictional red has lots of problems, folks, but it's flexible. So each country or jurisdiction, and that can be a first-tier jurisdiction, province in Ecuador, or the national government, can decide how the money is used. And that has to involve the consultations with those sectors. Most of those programs, none of the programs we're involved with 8 of them, are deciding to pay people not to clear. Because if you look at Sociobosque, if you look at the Costa Rica program, our analyses show that Sociobosque was about 1% efficient. In other words, for every hectare you paid to keep standing, well, you had to pay for 100 hectares to keep standing to actually protect one. Either they're not threatened, or they, in the end, were not cleared once the payment stopped. It's not an efficient way to use money. And also, what are they going to do? Those people, are they going to, instead of clearing that forest, are they going to cut another forest or something like that? So mostly, it's livelihood investments in better production systems, getting better incomes, especially for smallholders. And then with policies, with laws and regulations, you basically increase the protections for the standing forest. But the goal, I think, is, and I think Justin here is the mastermind is creating the environment where private sector can do what it does so well, mobilizing finance and people and expertise, come up with, build new industries, invest in things that are going to be good for that region, and increase incomes and create jobs and all of that.
Another question?
Yeah, Dan, fantastic. You always do such a great job of challenging some of the conventional thinking and pushing the boundaries of how people. My question, though, is I feel there's so much amazing work that has been done in these provinces, these states, in many tropical forest countries now, that we have these integrated land use plans, and they've done that. There's the frustration because finance hasn't flowed, but I also wonder, we get so bogged down in then terminology, and you used a lot of acronyms through the presentation, but JRED, jurisdictional red, it's become such a challenged term for all sorts of reasons. And then we get into the complexities of the greenhouse gas protocol, and actually these are just really bloody good land use plans that most European countries are not even close to having, in terms of how might you develop that. And I just wonder if is there a need for a kind of a rebrand of, actually, we call it jurisdictional red, but I wonder if that's in some ways holding us back. I don't know whether you're, and then, because you've got to then decouple that and the needs that those plans have from the source of finance. And I think so much of the problem, and this goes back to your greenhouse gas protocol question, is like, you're trying to tie individual units of capital to then individual units of environmental gain. And I that's a second question, but I mean, I think those land use plans are, I don't think we're doing credit to actually the work that these tropical forest countries have done.
I think you're absolutely right. I think people glaze over as soon as you get 3 syllables into jurisdictional. And I think you're absolutely right. The jargon gets in the way, the complexity gets in the way. In our meetings with senior government folks in the Brazilian national government around Brazil's emissions trading system, few people between red projects and jurisdictional red, results-based payments versus carbon mechanisms. And we need to simplify it and get back to, sustainable land use and some more intuitive ways of talking about this. And create, create entry points for business so that, it seems like a lot of businesses now are feeling a little scalded because they went into offsets, they got slapped. They went into ESG, they got slapped. They joined different groups. And I think you at the helm of TFA saw that directly. And, we need to make a safe path so that the companies that want part of their brand to be helping with these issues, there's clear things for them to do, roles to play, where they can put money in, and where that money, how that money will be leveraged, et cetera.
Okay, I'll take just a couple from online as we wrap up. One from Nicola Brennan, WWF UK. The Amazon soya moratorium was agreed by all major traders, covering 90% sales in the Amazon region, and successfully reducing conversion in the Amazon optimization of other land for soy production. If you do not have control of origin blocks, as in the moratorium done, but is now under serious threat of ending, you will be part of a supply chain that commercializes conversion of ecosystems. WWF does not agree that DCF cutoff dates should be pitched as in conflict with protection, but alongside initiatives to invest in intact forests.
Thank you for that position, and and we should talk. I think it's important to look at all of the dimensions of a sanction that is laid out on a supplier of food commodities, and these are sanctions, right? And we know that sanctions have a lot of indirect effects, and I think the indirect effect in a place like Brazil has been to alienate the farm sector, to reduce the amount of dialogue, to create a hotbed of conspiracy theory, and which basically has moved the whole sector further to the right. And I think a much more collaborative approach, the farm sector, for example, from day one rejected the soy moratorium. And, it was put out and they immediately said no, even though there's hardly any soy farmers who had land that they could legally clear on their farm. And I think so what has happened? Soy has moved into cattle pastures. If you go to Alta Floresta today in northern Mato Grosso, land prices are skyrocketing because it's flat and well drained, and soy is moving onto those pastures. And those ranchers are then capitalized and can move deeper into the frontier. And so we've pissed off the sector. Governors cannot support it because it does not recognize legal right to clear. And is it really helping if we're just capitalizing landholders to move further into the frontier? So I think it's a longer discussion, but
Great. I'll take one more from online from Alison Smith. How much of the drop in the credit market after 21 do you think was due to the greenwashing reports by The Guardian, etc.? And how much was just a drop off after Glasgow? And do you think the trend could reverse if confidence can be rebuilt with more effective verification?
Really good question. I don't know what the percentage of the impact was, but the Guardian articles were huge. 30% or 60%. I think they were part of a more general feeling that offsets the risk of greenwashing. And I think what we really need now is some really good communication to demonstrate that there is one way of generating credits, and then there's a much better way of generating credits, which itself still has, flaws. It's not perfect, but at some level, you know, when I push people about what is the alternative, you know, I'm not hearing alternatives for getting the funding we need for nature, for a place like the Amazon, for Indonesia, et cetera. What is the alternative? You know, there's a Tropical Forest Forever Fund idea that's led by Garo Batmanian. And maybe in 5 years that will be operational. But will it be another Amazon fund type mechanism that disperses 1.5 billion in 15 years? Or will it actually go to scale? So we've got something that's pretty good now. And yeah, I think you're exactly right. We need to build confidence that it's real.
Okay, great.
I think, Barbara, you had?
Yeah, I had a question. It's just I wanted to listen a bit more about the relationship you mentioned about frontiers and not actually pushing away farmers, and how actually red jurisdictional would be good to put them again in frontiers. And I mean, what for me was a bit confused, the relationship between frontier and the positive effect with, and the relationship with jurisdictional red. And also when you said about the national carbon market, the federal one, I was wondering, because of the lobby that you said and how does it actually compete with the jurisdictional one, if that then is just a de-risking instrument put up by market actors, and it's actually not, it's just de-risking tools, and you are more talking about blended finance. I don't know, just wondering about these different financial categories. Yes.
The point I was trying to make with the frontier is that there's currently a strong motive for responsible companies that don't want to be associated with deforestation to pull out of the active frontiers. And it's also the big companies, right? Grupo Maggi, they know exactly who their suppliers are for the UDR. And they tend to be in the more consolidated areas. They have the capital to pull it off and do all the monitoring. And so, you know, the smaller producers that are less capitalized are going to be cut out of the UDR, and they'll have to fend for themselves at other places. But we want companies in those active frontiers, and we want to make it less risky for them to work in those frontiers. And I think that calls on a new role for environmental advocacy. You know, we need to be pushing these companies to do good in these frontiers and to make investments and to create alternatives to shifting cultivation. And, you know, the drivers, that's one of the drivers. The big driver, of course, are the bigger operations. But so they need to be more competitive if they're actually making a big.
Great. I think we'll wrap up. We have drinks at the back here, so feel free to linger for some informal conversation. But I just want to wrap up by saying, Dan, I'm always impressed by your tales of the nuances of the frontier and of the Amazon, the interplay between companies and politics and motivations and these funding mechanisms as well. So it's always an education to understand the complexities and subtleties of this process of trying to shift things. And thank you for sharing with us. And,